you. I'm very pleased to be here this morning and to be at this conference, and I'm very grateful for the organizers for inviting me. It's a very stimulating and much needed subject to consider. Now, I've slightly retitled my paper to focus mainly on African communists, because as the conference is concerned with the role of European communists in African anti-colonial and imperialist struggles, I wish to approach the discussion from the opposite angle, namely by considering the concerns of African communists and their interactions with their European and Soviet counterparts. And I wish to discuss several examples where African communists developed Marxist analysis of their societies and challenged Soviet and European communist orthodoxies. Those concern theoretical discussions by South African and Algerian communists and socialists on the national and land questions. Although Marxism has reputedly been weak on the national question, that issue, along with the closely linked land question, was crucial for African communists, and they made important yet neglected theoretical contributions that were at times reflected in their policy and political decisions. I have argued elsewhere that despite its foothold, communism remained a weak movement in Africa, although its influence was sometimes greater than its numbers would suggest. Yet, another historian, Konstantin Katsakioris, writes that broader socialist visions and Marxism-Leninism as a theory and strategy for achieving national sovereignty and modernization made tremendous inroads all over Africa. One could find only a few governments and parties that did not define themselves as socialists. These seemingly contradictory statements can be reconciled by considering communism both as a political movement and as a top-down statist project. There is no question that when one considers all forms of socialism, it had a strikingly long-term presence in 20th century Africa. In addition to the interwar and post-war communist movements, whose success reflected their ability to align with trade union and national liberation movements, not to mention the degree of repression that they experienced, we can also point to the 1960s state-led attempts to find a third African socialist way between the capitalist West and Soviet communism, and from the 1970s, the state-led Soviet-aligned Afro-Marxist regimes that operated until the collapse of the Soviet Union. Nevertheless, the rapid fall of those statist regimes suggests that the social basis for socialism in those countries was weak. But one might also ask, was the impact of the communist movements longer lasting? That's something to consider. Initially, Marxist influence in colonial Africa was diffused from coastal areas via ports and along rail lines, which allowed the distribution of political propaganda. Its impact as a theory and a movement was felt primarily, not exclusively, in settler societies with urban proletariats, particularly South African Algeria, colonized respectively by the British and French imperial states. And it was also felt primarily at cultural crossroads such as Sudan, with its waves of Russian, British, and Egyptian communist influence. The writings of South African and Algerian communists have survived. That was far less so in the case of Sudan because of the intense repression faced by communists. In short, communism had distinct regional and national variations across Africa, and there is no single African pattern. So what did African communists see as their key social problems? Their views were framed first and foremost by the continent's late colonization, which was the vector through which capitalism penetrated Africa. What were colonization's economic consequences? Firstly, land expropriation, landlessness, and proletarianization, but not like the earlier European patterns in which gradual proletarianization led to urbanization and industrialization. Secondly, cash cropping at the expense of subsistence production. And thirdly, rail and infrastructure leading to coasts, enabling exports to Europe, but not trade across African societies. What were colonization's political consequences? Firstly, national oppression. Secondly, political and cultural repression. And thirdly, a bifurcated colonial state characterized broadly by the population's division into urban citizens and rural subjects under chiefly control, along the lines sketched out by Mahmoud Mamdani. Thus, the land and national questions, inextricably linked through colonial questions, through colonial conquest, were central for African communists. However, the African concern with colonialism was not matched by Soviet and European communists, who had developed their theoretical analyses based on the earlier development of capitalism in Europe and Russia. Moreover, Africa was a secondary geopolitical concern to the Comintern, which prioritized Europe and Asia, and to European communist parties, French communists being particularly concerned with Indochina and British with India. Not surprisingly, Soviet and European communists generally viewed African anti-colonial and nationalist struggles in instrumentalist terms, rather than of intrinsic democratic value. Thus, from the 1920s, as the prospects of revolution in Europe waned, the Comintern saw anti-colonial and national liberation struggles as means to undermine imperialism, with the Sixth Comintern Congress of 1928 arguing that peasant struggles could destabilize imperialism until capitalism collapsed. Under Stalin, the Soviets viewed Africa as a largely homogeneous continent with little internal differentiation. Soviet scholars were unable to visit the continent, and their approach reflected Soviet policy and ideology. From 1934, the People's Front era, Moscow ceased supporting anti-colonial movements that sought independence. Soviet scholars focused on the tiny African proletariat and derided nationalism as bourgeois, with the post-war Cominform criticizing nationalist movements that did not accept communist leadership. Soviet, European, and African communists developed different world outlooks. For Soviets and Europeans at the 1952 Vienna Peace Conference, concerned to ward off American aggression in Europe and the Eastern Bloc, world peace meant common struggles against capitalism and imperialism. Anti-colonialism was not a priority. On the one hand, the Soviets seem to have detached colonialism from capitalism. On the other, they felt that African anti-colonial movements were not sufficiently articulated with the struggle for peace. However, under Khrushchev, the Soviets began recognizing Africa's diverse social and economic conditions. They moderated their views of nationalist movements and sought to enhance their influence in Africa through cultural, educational, and political exchanges, especially after the 1955 Bandung Conference. But their interest in Africa still reflected their anti-US imperialism agenda. Let me take the examples of South Africa and Algeria to illustrate African communist concerns. Both societies experienced ruthless military conquest, massive land expropriation, and the imposition of rigid sectional divisions. But their geopolitical positions and the contrasting constitutional relationships with their colonial powers pulled them in different directions. Algeria's proximity to Europe pulled it more closely into European crises than South Africa. Algeria's indigenous class structure was more differentiated than South Africa's. It had an indigenous Muslim-landed elite, and a significant section of its labor force migrated to France, becoming a displaced proletariat. Algeria was pulled between two global religions, Islam and Christianity, which reinforced the social and political differences between the indigenous and settler populations. So not surprisingly, Algerian communists had a very difficult relationship with their nationalist movement. South Africa, by contrast, lacked both a black landed elite and a prosperous black peasantry, and its labor migrated within the country. Christianity subsumed the localized indigenous religious beliefs, and social cleavages were cross-cutting, as blacks and whites often shared common religious values despite this extreme racial oppression. South African communists had a close relationship with the nationalist movement. Across Africa, communists invariably endorsed Lenin's view that the right to self-determination, national self-determination, was fundamental for democracy and working class internationalism, typically interpreting national self-determination as independent statehood. However, a minority argued for self-determination according to the Soviet model, that is, national autonomy within a federation, a model that was particularly appealing in crisis-ridden multi-ethnic countries such as Sudan and Ethiopia, but where its proponents were often severely repressed. But in Algeria and South Africa, the belief in a single multicultural state prevailed, with brief exceptions. Debates on national self-determination were broadly influenced by the Comintern, but differed in each case. In South Africa, a self-governing dominion, Marxist debates oscillated between those who saw the oppressed black majority as a colony needing self-determination, a colony of a special type, and those who believed that the problem could be solved through democracy. In Algeria, claimed by the French state as part of France, but where the Muslim majority was essentially colonized, communists oscillated between equality and independence. So first, let me take the South African case. In South Africa, the Comintern's Native Republic thesis, introduced in 1927-28, laid the foundations for subsequent debates on the national and land questions. The thesis called for an independent Native Republic as a stage towards a workers' and peasants' government, positing a peasant base rather than a proletarian struggle. Given Marxism's historic concern with the urban working class, the thesis caused great acrimony within the Communist Party of South Africa and catalyzed the development of a Trotskyist movement. But with the Comintern's 1930s shift to the European priority of an anti-fascist popular front, the Communist Party put the Native Republic thesis aside and concentrated on trade union and electoral work. Consequently, Trotskyists played a disproportionate role in theorizing the national and land questions, sparking a tradition of intense left-wing debate. They maintained that the struggle to achieve democratic rights could not be achieved under capitalism and would lead towards a permanent revolution. Since the organized urban proletariat, at the time overwhelmingly white, racist, and protectionist, could not be a working class vanguard, Trotsky stressed migrant labor as a vanguard transmitting political ideas from town to countryside. That was a key distinguishing feature of the South African political economy. Lenin had argued that Russia's relatively rapid rural proletarianization, with urban factory workers often coming directly from their traditional rural societies, laid the basis for an urban-rural proletarian alliance. The Trotskyist strand closest to that position contended that migrant workers constituted a Janus-faced tribal proletariat, able to link urban and rural workers jointly oppressed by their lack of democratic rights. But another Trotskyist strand argued that rural Africans should be mobilized on the basis of their land hunger. Its best-known proponent, Unity Movement activist Isaac Tabata, argued that rural Africans would reject nationalization because for them, the state's trusteeship of the African reserves, the rural areas where Africans were forced to live, was tantamount to nationalization. But they would also reject capitalism because the legal right to buy land without the means to do so could never satisfy land hunger. The Second World War accelerated African urbanization. The National Party's 1948 apartheid program reversed that trend, pushing Africans back to the rural reserves. The 1950s saw continuous upheaval in the reserves, which culminated with the 1960 Pondoland uprising in the Eastern Cape. Despite their political differences, communists and Trotskyists shared similar observations of these events. Like Tabata, the communist Govan Mbeki recognized migrant labor's importance. Given the limited class differentiation in the reserves, both men stressed the political solidarity of rural Africans. Both maintained that the intense, short-lived urban protests needed to be sustained by the slower developing but longer-lived rural protests. South African Marxists also debated the national question. South Africa's distinctive feature was the legal codification of white supremacy, which divided the population into separate sectional groups. There was no Marxist consensus on the national question, and the South African Communist Party used Stalin's empirical definition of a nation as a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. The dominant Communist Party perspective reflected the influence of the leading Soviet Africanist Ivan Potemkin, who argued that South Africa was developing into two nations, African and Anglo-Afrikaner. For communist Michael Harmel, that meant white monopoly capitalism and a colonized black majority, although his comrade Lionel Foreman argued for a multinational federal model, signaling internal communist debate. By contrast, the unity movement's largely Trotskyist leadership argued for a subjective definition of nationhood, insisting all that is required for a people to be a nation is community of interest, love of their country, pride in being citizens of their country. Yet, as with the land question, there were overlaps across the communist-Trotskyist divide. Thus, communist Jack Simons and Trotskyist Kenneth Jordan both argued that South Africa's national question would be solved through democracy, not independence. They agreed that the color bar stifled the development of a black bourgeoisie and prevented significant class differentiation amongst the oppressed. The black working class would lead the liberation movement, reinforcing South Africa's tendency to develop into one nation. In 1955, with the adoption of the Freedom Charter, whose national clause proclaimed all national groups shall have equal rights, the Communist Party shelved discussion of the national question. Echoing the Native Republic thesis, its 1962 program maintained that South Africa was characterized by colonialism of a special type, that national democracy was a precondition for socialism, and that the Communist Party should continue its alliance with the ANC, the African National Congress. Throughout the armed struggle years, the Communist Party's theory, organization, and policy displayed a significant Soviet influence, despite the upsurge of independent left-wing contestations inside the country during the 1970s and 1980s. Well, how does the Algerian case compare? The demand for Algerian independence had an analogous impact to the Native Republic thesis in South Africa. The Comintern's 1922 call for the liberation of Algeria and Tunisia increased state repression and led to resignations and expulsions from the French Communist Party's Algerian region. Nonetheless, by the decade's end, communists in Algeria accepted independence as policy. However, the French Communist Party saw independence in instrumentalist terms, and in the 1930s argued that the anti-fascist People's Front necessitated Franco-Algerian unity. Independence was sidelined, anti-colonialism deemed to be divisive. Despite the launch of an autonomous Algerian Communist Party in 1936, French communist dominance over the Algerian communists remained striking. In February 1939, with war on the horizon, the French Communist General Secretary Maurice Thorez provided the rationale for Franco-Algerian unity, namely that Algeria was a nation in formation needing French guidance. The right to self-determination did not mandate separation. Despite heated debates, the Algerian communists followed the French Communist Party. The Second World War drew Algeria far more closely into the European orbit than was the case for South Africa. The periodization of the two liberation movements diverged, with the Algerian struggle becoming more compressed. The Algerian Communist Party's acceptance of Franco-Algerian unity exacerbated tensions with the rapidly developing nationalist movement. Those tensions peaked following the May 1945 massacre of tens of thousands of Algerians in the East, usually known as the Sétif massacre. Initially, the Algerian Communist Party followed the French Communist Party's claims that fascists had provoked the massacre. But from 1946 on, the Algerian Communist Party gave greater attention to the national question, attracting young Algerians concerned with class and social justice. And although the French communists promoted the idea of a French Union based on the Soviet Union's federal model, Algerian communists dropped that idea as nationalism spread. Again, we see the importance of different world perspectives. The French Communist Party, as part of the Common Forum, focused less on Algeria and more on fighting American imperialism in Europe and the Eastern Bloc. That left the Algerian communists more autonomy to develop their own position. And the Algerian Party was clearly concerned primarily with African and Asian anti-colonial struggles. The War of Independence, launched by the FLN on 1st November 1954, compelled Algerian communists to rethink the national question. In 1958, the PCA's theoretical journal, Réalité Algérienne et Marxisme, included a substantial article that showed a shift from both Stalin's empirical criteria for nationhood and Thorez's nation in formation thesis. Algeria indeed constituted a nation, the author argued. Algerian nationalism's values of land and liberty dated back to the Berbers, the author began. The Arabs introduced Islam, but allowed the Berbers to retain their customs and social organization, laying the basis for a multicultural nation. Comparing Algerian nationalism to a flowing and ever-changing river, the author modified Stalin's definition to include fluidity and subjectivity, arguing that independent Algeria would include both the Arabo-Berber people, who seemingly fit Stalin's criteria, and the Jews and Europeans, who accepted Algeria as their country. That was a recognition that Stalin's definition could not address the problems of building a national identity from multiple existing identities, identities that might remain fluid over time. The war also compelled Algerian communists to analyze the land question, which became particularly explosive as Algerians seized land vacated by fleeing Europeans. An article by the Algerian Communist Party leader Bachir Hadj Ali began with the conquest, expropriation, and concentration of land that led to rural proletarianization. Like South Africa's Govan Mbeki, Hadj Ali stressed the rapidly developing political consciousness of rural people. Participation in the struggle helped the rural poor to throw off their inferiority complex vis-a-vis both the colonizers and the Muslim landed elite, enabling rural protests to develop into a guerrilla struggle based on reciprocity between the Liberation Army and the rural poor. However, while South Africans stressed rural solidarity, Hadj Ali stressed rural class differentiation, reflecting the nature of rural society in Algeria, and which necessitated cross-class alliance against large landowners, both European and Muslim. In sum, both South African and Algerian communists stressed the need to build multicultural nations, but their analyses reflected their distinctive social conditions. While the Communist Party's financial dependence on the Soviet Union during the armed struggle in the South African case reinforced its long-term acceptance of Soviet views, that was not so for Algeria. During the War of Independence, the Algerian Communist Party broke with the French Communist Party on several critical positions. Firstly, sabotage, with the French Communists opposing and the Algerian Communists supporting. Secondly, desertion from the French army, which the French Communists opposed and the Algerian Communists supported. Third, special powers passed in March 1956. The French Communists supported that on anti-fascist grounds, namely to gain Socialist Party support for détente with the Soviets, but Algerian Communists were its victims. And finally, recognition of the FLN's provisional government, the Gouvernement Provisoire de la République Algérienne, established in September 1958. The Algerian Communists recognized the provisional government by November 58. That is less than 2 months after it was established. The Soviets recognized it in late 1960, and the French Communists in early 1961. So, although the Algerian Communist Party had been born into a relationship of dependency with the French Communist Party, ultimately, the influx of Algerian members, alongside the pressure of the war, compelled it to change track. The Soviet Union and the French Communist Party followed the Algerian Communists, reversing the conventional direction in which international communist policy was assumed to flow. So communist policy followed the national struggle. In conclusion, for African communists, colonialism was both the means by which capitalism penetrated their countries and the source of their national oppression. Yet even in the relatively similar cases of South Africa and Algeria, their communist movements took very different paths. In part, that reflected geopolitics. South Africa's distance from Britain allowed its left to develop with relative autonomy, while Algeria's proximity to France enabled the French communists to maintain intellectual dominance over their Algerian counterparts for decades. But other factors were also at play. Despite South African socialism's organizational pluralism and the South African Communist Party's internal debates, most communists remained tied to Soviet models. The main critiques of Soviet and Stalinist approaches came from socialists outside the South African Communist Party. Algerian communists, by contrast, were compelled by the pressure of the war to modify and even shift from Soviet theory and policy, even if temporarily. In contrast to African communists, Soviet and European communists underestimated the theoretical significance of colonialism and its relationship to capitalism. Reflecting their perspectives as non-colonized peoples, they did not see colonialism as inherent to capitalism. Moreover, instead of seeing the anti-colonial struggle as inherently democratic, they viewed it in instrumentalist terms to suit their own shifting geopolitical aims. Their failure to seriously consider colonialism as a key manifestation of 20th century capitalism rendered their aspiration for a global communism untenable. Thank you.